I'm a Christian minister who's been watching Sam Harris for many years and watching Jordan Peterson for the last couple of years with great interest. And so I've loved to see the debates that have been held very recently, a couple in Vancouver and then one in Dublin and one in London, where the two men have got together to talk about ideas. How brilliant that we live in an age where two people decide to come and discuss in-depth ideas, and thousands of people come on the night, and then millions more discuss it online. We live in an age where the spoken word is very, very powerful, and people are listening at length to deep ideas. And I'm thrilled about that as a Christian minister. I just think so often we in the church, we feel like we've got a message to tell, but people don't want messages, right? They don't want to be preached at. They don't want truth. So we just try to sugarcoat the bitter pill of truth, and we offer them entertainment and then try to crowbar in the truth later. And I just think, events like the Harris versus Peterson debate go to show that, you know what? Actually, people want truth, they want to debate, they want messages, they want to think deeply about ideas. And so that's brilliant. And the other thing that was brilliant about these debates is it got two men who disagreed about things to actually discuss in fruitful ways. I thought it was a fruitful discussion. And I thought the way that they did that was really interesting, because I just discovered last week about what you do to socialize rabbits. If you get two different rabbits from two different litters, they're probably going to tear each other in a frenzy of fur and blood, and it's not going to be pretty. What you really need to do is you need to acclimatize them to one another. So what you do over the course of maybe a week or longer is you put them in two hutches side by side, and there's a big partition wall, but they're both looking at the same thing. They're both in the same environment, and they're both having the same common horizon, the same common task, you might think. And that's really important for getting them to get on with each other. And then what you do is at some point you swap the hutches, and so one rabbit goes to the other's hutch, the other rabbit goes to the other hutch, and they smell one another's stuff, and they inhabit the world of the other rabbit until at some stage you can remove the partition and they're best friends forever. Isn't that interesting about how you can get people to get on with each other across divides? And I thought this debate did that, because I thought both Harris and Peterson are facing a common vision. They both want to be moral realists. They both want to say that there is an objective moral reality. Some things are better and some things are worse. And you can say that. And we don't need to get lost in the swamp of relativism, which leads eventually to nihilism. You don't want to go down that road, and neither of them want to go down that road. And so in their common task of avoiding relativism, they have this common horizon. And then what they did in the debates is they did swap over at points. In the second debate, they steel-manned each other's position. What is steel-manning? Well, it's the opposite of straw-manning. If I strawman your position, I put it as weakly as I possibly can, as most ridiculously as I possibly can. But that, of course, does not lead to a good argument. What you really need to do is steelman the other person's position, i.e. put their position as absolutely strongly as you possibly can. And so what we're going to see first is first Harris steelmanning Jordan Peterson's position, and then Peterson steelmanning Harris's position. And I think we'll both see how important and how really valuable steel-manning is in getting people to see one another's perspective. And it'll also give us a great little encapsulation of what the two men believe.
Clearly, I don't understand how valuable stories are, how deep they go, the degree to which stories encode not only the wisdom of our ancestors, but quite possibly the wisdom born of the hard knocks of evolution of the species. Right? So there's no telling how deep the significance of the information encoded in stories goes. And there's a class of stories that are religious stories, and they're religious for a reason, because they're dealing with the deepest questions in human life. They're questions about what constitutes a good life, what's worth living for, what's worth dying for. These are things that if each individual just thrust onto the stage of his own life, not knowing where he is, and tasked with figuring out how to live all on his own, or even in a collection of others who are similarly unguided by ancient wisdom, this is not knowledge we can recapitulate for ourselves easily. And so we edit or ignore these ancient stories at our peril, at minimum at some considerable risk, because we don't know how much, we don't really know what baby is in the bathwater. And so we should have immense respect for these traditions.
Sam believes that there are two fundamental dangers to psychological and social stability. Religious fundamentalism, essentially on the right, and moral relativism and nihilism on the left. Sam's argument is that we require a value system that allows us to escape these twin dangers. One stultifies us and the other leaves us hopeless, let's say. And that value system has to be grounded in something real. And the only thing that he can see that actually constitutes real in any provable sense, and there's a certain amount of historical and conceptual weight behind this claim, is the domain of empirical facts as they've been manifested in the sciences and technologies that have made us incredibly powerful and increasingly able to flourish in the world. And so I would say that's Sam's argument and his criticisms of my position. So,
okay, so you write my next book, I'll write yours.
So here's my summary of their two positions, and I'm going to employ some biblical conceptuality to the frame. And I hope you see that whether you believe in the Bible or not, that actually it serves the discussion. Okay, what I see both men doing is looking at the realm of the flesh. Okay, the flesh in the Bible is just our biological reality. You look down at your biological reality and you see strengths and you see weaknesses. You see things that leads to the flourishing of the species, and you see things that drag you down to hell, sort of, to use the Peterson kind of terminology in that sense. So the flesh is just our human abilities, our biological realities. And both men are looking at the flesh and they want to be able to say, this is better than that. Right? Because there are different expressions of the flesh across different cultures. And you don't want to get to the point where one culture says, hey, we believe in protecting and honoring this minority group, even though they're weak, even though they're feeble, even though they might not help us flourish in 100 ways. It is really important to us that we honor their common humanity and we protect that minority. That's one culture. Another culture says, hey, well, each to their own, because we've gassed our minority and we've soared to heights unknown in terms of the flourishing of our society. And we've actually found that persecuting and doing away with that minority has really helped us. But, each to their own, who's to say what's right? Now, both Harris and Peterson, they want to say what's right? They want to say that this culture is better than that culture, and therefore that this culture should move towards that culture, should ascend. There is an up. There is a true north. So both Harris and Peterson, they want to say that there's something above the flesh that adjudicates the flesh and that is able to say what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is evil. Now, for both of them, that thing that is above, you could demonstrate, you could call that thing the logos, right? The logos is another biblical word that Peterson uses quite a lot. The logos is the Greek word for word. It's also sort of the word for meaning. It's the word for rationality. It has that kind of semantic range. It's the word from which we get the word logic. And for Peterson, he kind of sees that there is a word that has emerged from below, and we'll see what that is in a second. And for Harris, he sees that there is a word that has emerged from below and yet stands above the flesh and can judge all things and adjudicate. And that word will save us from the swamp of moral relativism. My point, though, is neither of them save you from moral relativism, okay? Neither of them can actually do what they want to do. And at the end of the video, I'll tell you who can do what Harris and Peterson can't do. But first of all, let's think about Peterson's word. Who is the logos, according to Peterson? Well, Peterson believes in the 3.5 billion year emergence of humanity, well, the species, in terms of myths and mythological structures. And in the West, the great hero, the great archetypical hero, is Christ, the Logos. And he is the one who can judge all other people. He puts it like this.
You have an inbuilt structure. It's deep. It's partly biological. It's partly an emergent consequence of your socialization. And you view the world of facts through that structure. And it's a structure of value. Now, that structure of value may be derived from the world of facts over the evolutionary time frame, but it's not derived from the world of facts over the time frame that you inhabit, and it can't be.
So the wisdom of the ages has emerged over immense stretches of time and has been encoded in these stories, these myths. And you can examine the myths across the cultures and you can find these archetypal heroes, and Christ is the hero of heroes. He is the Logos by whom we can judge what is up and what is down, what is good and what is evil. And so in this way, Peterson says we can have a Logos, we can have something above the flesh that judges the flesh, and therefore we avoid the nihilistic swamp. Except that he doesn't, and he can't. You see, Harris points out again and again that the Logos that Peterson has identified is really just a Judeo-Christian idea. It's not the universal that Peterson is seeking.
Good and evil do not have the same meaning in the East. Buddhism and Hinduism do something very different with good and evil.
I'm willing to accept your definitions of good and evil for the current argument.
The truth is, there's just not even, evil is just ignorance on some level.
And again, Harris says this.
Because if you take the Buddhist framework and map it onto this continuum, you don't get good and evil. You get essentially wisdom and ignorance.
And other cultures just do not conceptualize religion the same way that the Christian West does. Peterson is slowly waking up to this fact.
For a lot of my life, I would say, more interested in the universal truths expressed in religious belief across different cultures. But I've become more and more aware of the important distinctions between the religious cultures, maybe in the last 10 years.
But still, Peterson operates as though all religions were basically like Christianity, and it just isn't the case. An honest look at the religions of the world does not look at basically Christianity in different dress, right? That's not what the religions of the world are like. They are really radically different conceptions of ultimate reality, right? And that presents a huge problem for Peterson because he wants a universal figure at the top of his hierarchy of values. He wants a universal figure who can judge all flesh and say what's right and what's wrong, but it seems like he's got a very located Logos, right? Because it's just this Christian idea. You go over to the East and there is no concept of good and evil in the same sense as you have in the West. And so Peterson has a real problem, especially as an evolutionary psychologist. He's going to want to say that Buddhism is perfectly adapted to that environment in which it has emerged. And Hinduism is perfectly adapted to the environment in which it is. Islam, the same. Christianity, the same. And therefore, he's just lost the universality of the Logos that he seeks. And so I think Peterson is going to have to admit, if he's true to his evolutionary psychology, he's going to have to admit that the Logos is not the universal judge that he seeks. But Harris, he also has a problem. See, Harris's Logos is rationality. And that is what the word logos means. It does mean, logic, rationality, that kind of thing. And so for Harris, in the Enlightenment, what we have is emerging from the flesh has been this enlightened mind that is able to look at all the moral landscape around it and is able to judge better and worse, higher and lower. And this is where we have thrown off the shackles of our ancient history, and certainly we can throw off the shackles of the nonsense of religion. And now, as enlightened humanity, we stand above the moral landscape and we can adjudicate good and evil, right and wrong. But Peterson shows the problems with this again and again and again. Peterson says, you are not this dispassionate observer of the moral landscape. You are not outside the system as you look at the moral landscape. You are absolutely embroiled in this flesh, embroiled in these processes by which you have emerged, and therefore what you're looking at is just a tiny fraction of what the moral landscape really is, and all of it is being colored by your a priori assumptions. That's a phrase that Peterson uses again and again in these debates. A priori just means at the beginning of, right? Before you even look at the facts, you've already got values in mind, and you cannot look at the facts without those values in mind. It's a point that Peterson makes repeatedly.
But what you said was, okay, here's these belief systems that are ancient and complex, and we can step outside of them, and there's this transcendent rationality that we could all aspire to that would solve the problems. It's like, okay, what is it?
Well,
what is it exactly?
It is, at a minimum, to value all of the variables that conspire to make the one life we know we have
Okay, you
worth
can't
living.
value all those variables.
Well, no, we're doing it right. We do it every day in how we organize
No, we
ourselves
don't,
in
because
society.
we apply an a priori framework to the variables to reduce them to a tiny subset that we can manage. And it's the nature of that a priori framework that we haven't been able to have a discussion about. That you cannot view the world without an a priori structure. And that a priori structure has a dogmatic element. And so you can't just say, well, let's get rid of the dogma, because you can't perceive the world without a structure. I still need an answer to the question about what it is that's this transcendental rational structure without an a priori dogma, because I don't see it.
Well, it's not, again, we touched on this a little bit last night, in that at some point we have to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. At some point we make a move that is not self-justifying and is not justified by any other move that's more rudimentary.
Right, that's a statement of faith.
So this is a problem for Harris. We do not look at the moral landscape the way a scanner looks at a barcode and just reads off these neutral facts from which we can then ascend to values. No, the values are at the very beginning of the process. You don't go from facts to values. Actually, you have to go from values to facts, always. This has just been pointed out by every moral philosopher going, whether they're a believer in orthodox religions or not. Everyone points out the fact that actually you don't begin with facts. You actually begin with a priori assumptions. And Sam Harris even admits this, and he says you've got to begin with certain intuitions. There's got to be this framework that you begin with, and Harris says you pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But that is just an admission that you don't go from facts to values, actually. You go from values to facts. And Christian theologians have noticed this down through the centuries. We've spoken about faith-seeking understanding, which is precisely what we're talking about in this debate. Faith-seeking understanding. I have certain a priori assumptions about the logos, right? About the rationality of the cosmos and about how that relates to my mind and how that relates to the world that I'm observing. I need those a priori assumptions that are faith positions. But then it's a case of faith-seeking understanding. That's the way it must be. It's just the nature of the case. And if Harris thinks that he can go from facts to values, he is absolutely mistaken. Actually, you have to go from values to facts. Okay, so there is an in-principle objection to Harris, and I think it is a catastrophic defeater for his position. But if that wasn't bad enough, Harris doesn't just have an in-principle problem with his project, he also faces the problem of its workability. You see, what Harris wants to notice in the moral landscape is simply human suffering. Right? Simply my perceptions of the pleasure or pain that I get out of, the well-being that I have in certain scenarios. And Peterson again and again points out that that is a very limited way of assessing what is good and evil. Good and evil applies not just to the pain that I feel in a situation. That phrase evil might also apply to the pleasure I find in inflicting pain on someone else. So Peterson says this.
Because the question is, what's bad about hell? Now you say the suffering. It's like, fair enough, man. True enough, but not true enough. So in Dante's vision...
What's also bad about hell? In addition to the suffering.
The actions that put you there, the malevolence that generates it.
Well, sure. Okay, but that's part of the suffering. So
No, it's not. No, it's not. It's not the same as the suffering. It's not the having your hand cut off. It's the pleasure that's derived by the person who cut it off.
So Harris says that he can factor those different things into his calculus. That there is the bad of experiencing pain, and there is the bad of inflicting pain. And he says that he can all factor that into his calculus. But those are apples and oranges, and how is he going to weigh them? What value structure is he going to bring to bear on that calculation? It's not at all obvious. It will need a value structure prior to it. And so, again, this is a defeater of Sam Harris's position. But if that wasn't bad enough, there's also another problem with Sam Harris's position in that we are just no good at measuring the moral landscape.
And the black box problem is, if we could measure well-being, it's like, yeah, that's a big problem, Sam. Like, we have measures of well-being, and they're terrible.
Yeah.
Like, they are.
No, I'm agreeing. I don't think but it's not a problem for my thesis. We don't have measures for anything we care about, really.
Yeah, but I mean, if your thesis is that if we had the measures of well-being that were appropriate, we could use them in a positive way, and the response is, but we don't have those measures, it's like, okay, well then what do we do?
So Harris's position is just a non-starter. It doesn't get off the ground because there are, in principle, objections to his entire enterprise. But also, he's got measurement problems. He doesn't know what to measure, and that's going to need value structures applied to that question. And his measurement techniques are not fit for purpose. So his project just does not work. But also, it does not avoid the nihilistic swamp that he wants it to avoid. You see, Harris, he very much goes eastwards in his conception of good and evil. And I guess he has to, because he is a committed determinist. He does not believe in free will at all. And therefore, he's very much liable to say that evil actions, or what we would call evil actions in the Christianized West, what we would call evil actions are just biological malfunctions. And he gives this example of the mass murderer who actually, it turns out, has a tumor pressing on his brain. He doesn't see that as one interesting example and as that being one factor in the mass murderer's crimes. He sees that as being an allegory for all evil.
The reason why evil is susceptible to total deflation is, if you agree with me, evil is a category of human misbehavior, human intention, that we don't understand significantly at the level of the brain, but if we did understand it totally at the level of the brain, then every evil person we had in the dock at trial would be just like Charles Whitman with his brain tumor after he shot up everyone at the University of Texas, right? So like he's the prototypically evil mass murderer, but he's complaining about this change that overcame his personality, and he thinks it would be a good idea that if after the cops kill me, you autopsy my brain, because I don't know why I'm doing any of this, right? And lo and behold, he had a glioblastoma pressing on his amygdala, and all of a sudden it made sense of his behavior in a way that a full understanding of psychopathy, or every other variant of human evil, would make sense of it in a way that would be deflationary ethically.
Okay.
And then you would look at someone like Saddam Hussein, or the worst evil person you could imagine, and you would say, well, he's actually unlucky. There but for the grace of biology go I. Because if I had that brain, if I had those genes, if I had those influences that gave me those synapses, I would be just like him. Now, if you think there's some other element that gives us free will, and now then you and I are disagreeing, then that's a factual claim that's at variance with mine. But if we are just on some level malfunctioning biological systems when we're being evil, then a complete understanding of evil would cancel that category.
You see, adopting Sam Harris's framework will abolish the category of evil. And at that point, I think we are heading towards the relativistic swamp. So I think that both Harris and Peterson have failed to avoid what they want to avoid. So then let me suggest a solution, okay? The solution is still the logos, right? They both got that right. They've got it right that we need to rise above the flesh, and they've both got it right that we need a logos that adjudicates among the flesh. But their logos emerges from within the system and can never escape the system. And therefore they cannot escape the relativism inherent in that project. We do need a transcendent logos. We absolutely do. Good news, we've got one. John chapter 1 verse 1 says, "In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. He was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made." Wonderfully, in verse 14 it says, "The Logos became flesh and dwelt among us." So there has been this gift of an adjudicator that can tell us right and wrong, a light by which we can judge darkness. But that light is not shut off from us just because we are flesh and he is the Logos. That Logos comes to us in grace and in mercy. And this is what we really need. I don't just need to know what is good. I need forgiveness for my evil. I don't just need a perceptual structure by which to ascertain what is light, right? I need him to shine into my darkness, to help me and to heal me. And I'm afraid that with Peterson and with Harris, I don't get that. But with the Bible, which, as Peterson says, has absolutely shaped the world that we live in and has shaped the enlightenment that Sam Harris so prizes, within that Bible story, there is a solution to the problem. Harris and Peterson have not avoided the relativistic swamp. But in Jesus, you have someone who descended into our swamp in order to get us out. Well, in my next video, I'm going to talk about some more issues because you might be thinking, right, well, if we go with Christianity, then what about all Sam Harris's objections to Christianity? What about slavery, right? What about Old Testament wars, right? What about this practice of sacrifice? These are all objections that Sam Harris brings to Christianity, and it's worth dealing with those in the next video. But for now, if you want to escape from the swamp of relativism, I say come to Jesus. See you next time.